Abraham, one of the most significant figures in the Bible, is often referred to as the father of faith. His journey of faith is marked by many trials, but none as challenging as the command to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac. This story, found in Genesis 22, is a profound example of faith, obedience, and the mysterious ways in which God works in the lives of his people. In this script, we will explore 7 key points that delve into why God tested Abraham's faith with Isaac and the deep spiritual lessons that emerge from this narrative. Point 1. The test of absolute obedience. When God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, he was placing before Abraham the ultimate test of obedience. Isaac was not just any son. He was the child of promise, the one through whom God had promised to fulfill his covenant with Abraham. This covenant included the promise that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that they would inherit the land of Canaan. The command to sacrifice Isaac seemed to contradict everything God had promised. Yet it was precisely this contradiction that made the test so severe. Would Abraham obey God, even when it seemed to nullify God's earlier promises? This test required Abraham to surrender everything, including his understanding of how God's promises would be fulfilled. It was a test of whether Abraham valued the blessings of God more than God himself. Abraham's willingness to obey, even when he did not understand, demonstrated a faith that transcended human logic and reasoning. His obedience was not just an act of compliance. It was an expression of profound trust in God's character and a recognition that God's ways are higher than human ways. Point 2. The demonstration of genuine faith. The test of Abraham's faith with Isaac was designed to reveal the depth and genuineness of his faith. Faith, as defined in Hebrews 11:1, is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Abraham's journey to Mount Moriah with Isaac was a physical manifestation of his faith in the unseen promises of God. Despite the seemingly impossible situation, Abraham believed that God could even raise Isaac from the dead if necessary. Hebrews 11:19. Abraham's faith was not passive. It was active and demonstrated through his actions. He did not question God's command, nor did he hesitate in his obedience. His faith was deeply rooted in his relationship with God, cultivated over years of walking with him. This test served to confirm that Abraham's faith was genuine, enduring, and capable of withstanding even the most severe trials. It was a faith that was willing to obey, even when the cost was the most precious thing in his life. Point 3. The foreshadowing of Christ's sacrifice. The story of Abraham and Isaac is rich with symbolism, particularly in how it foreshadows the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Isaac, the beloved son, carried the wood for the burnt offering up the mountain, just as Jesus, the beloved Son of God, carried the cross up to Calvary. Both were submitted to the will of their fathers, and both were obedient unto death. However, there is a crucial difference. While Isaac was spared at the last moment by God's intervention, Jesus was not. He became the ultimate sacrifice for the sins of humanity. This foreshadowing is not just a coincidence. It is a deliberate part of God's redemptive plan. By testing Abraham in this way, God was preparing the world for the greater sacrifice that was to come. The ram caught in the thicket, which was provided as a substitute for Isaac, points to Jesus, who was provided as a substitute for us. The story of Abraham and Isaac is a prophetic picture of the gospel, showing us the lengths to which God would go to redeem humanity. Point 4. The revelation of God's provision. One of the most profound revelations in the story of Abraham and Isaac is the name Jehovah-Jireh, which means, "The Lord will provide." As Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, God intervened and provided a ram as a substitute. This moment was not just a relief for Abraham. It was a powerful demonstration of God's provision. Throughout the Bible, God is portrayed as a provider, not only of physical needs, but also of everything necessary for fulfilling his purposes. This story teaches that God's provision often comes at the moment of greatest need, sometimes in ways we could never anticipate. Abraham learned that God is faithful to provide, even when the situation seems hopeless. This principle applies to all believers. When we are called to sacrifice or to trust God in difficult circumstances, we can be confident that He will provide what is needed in His perfect timing. Point 5. The strengthening of the covenant relationship. God's covenant with Abraham was a foundational element of the biblical narrative, encompassing promises of land, descendants, and blessings for all nations. By testing Abraham with the command to sacrifice Isaac, God was not only testing Abraham's faith, but also reinforcing and deepening the covenant relationship. After Abraham passed the test, God reaffirmed His promises to Abraham in even stronger terms, emphasizing that because of Abraham's obedience, his descendants would indeed be numerous, and that all nations on earth would be blessed through them. Genesis 22:16-18. This test served to solidify the covenant, demonstrating that its fulfillment was dependent on God's faithfulness rather than human merit. It also highlighted that the blessings of the covenant would come through faith and obedience. Abraham's willingness to offer Isaac showed that he trusted God completely, even when the promise seemed to be at risk. This deepened the relationship between God and Abraham. Point 6. The importance of fear and reverence for God. In Genesis 22:12, after Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, the angel of the Lord said, "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." The fear of God, in this context, is not about being afraid in a negative sense, but about having a deep reverence, respect, and awe for God. This reverence is the foundation of true worship and obedience. It recognizes God's holiness, authority, and the rightful place He holds in our lives. Abraham's fear of God was demonstrated through his willingness to sacrifice what was most precious to him. This act showed that Abraham did not place anything above God, not even his beloved son. The story teaches us that true faith is inseparable from the fear of God. It is a faith that leads to complete trust and obedience, even when it requires great personal sacrifice. This reverence for God is essential for a right relationship with Him, as it acknowledges His ultimate authority and our dependence on His grace and mercy. Point 7. The universal lesson of trust in God's plan. The testing of Abraham's faith with Isaac provides a universal lesson for all believers. Trust in God's plan, even when it is difficult to understand. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, despite the apparent contradiction to God's promises, teaches us that God's plans are beyond our comprehension and that His ways are perfect. This story encourages believers to trust in God's timing, His provision, and His ultimate purposes, even when circumstances seem impossible. Abraham's story is a call to every believer to exercise faith, knowing that God is faithful and that He works all things together for good to those who love Him. Romans 8:28. It reminds us that faith will inevitably be tested, but through these tests, our relationship with God is strengthened and His purposes are fulfilled in our lives. Abraham's example is one of total surrender and trust in God's plan, a model that all believers are called to follow. The test of Abraham's faith with Isaac is one of the most profound stories in the Bible, rich with spiritual significance and lessons for believers today. It teaches us about the nature of true faith, the importance of obedience, and the depth of God's provision and promises. Most importantly, it foreshadows the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan for humanity. As we reflect on this story, may we be inspired to trust God fully, even in the face of the most challenging tests, knowing that He is always faithful and His plans are perfect.